Go ahead, thanks.
Okay. Well, welcome to this talk on the nodes when they are squared, so the nodes can be in Gemini and Sagittarius for this talk, or the third house and the ninth house. And before we get started, I just want to introduce myself really quick. My name is Sabrina Monarch, and I write weekly forecasts at monarchastrology.com. And I also have a podcast, Magic of the Spheres. And working with the nodal axis, and specifically the nodes when they are squared, has been one of my focuses since I got into evolutionary astrology in 2012. And so a little bit about what planets square the nodes means and kind of like the scope of this talk. So the nodal axis, we have a typical storyline that the south node is our past lives, and that the north node is like a future direction that we're working or aspiring to in this lifetime. And this is kind of the basic trajectory if the nodal axis is not squared by another planet. But then you add a planet or planets at a 90-degree angle to the nodal axis, and it suggests that the individual has been vacillating back and forth between the realities represented by the north and south node, and not fully integrating the planet that is square the nodes. This has created a kind of synthesis between the nodal archetypes and kind of like a hybrid personality pattern. So if you see someone with a south node or their nodes aren't squared, you can feel, okay, they've been developing their south node, and you can feel them kind of naturally go into their north node at their first Saturn return is like a basic like metric, basic scenario. But the skipped step, which is what it's called in evolutionary astrology, I just typically just say planets square the nodes, and I think of it as like a karmic impasse. For the scope of this talk, it's not about the planet itself squaring the nodes, but it's about what the nodal axis is doing and how it expresses. And you can see the nodes as like personality structures and personality traits and even life circumstances. So I'm going to get into like the south node in Gemini in the third house and north node in Sagittarius or the ninth house. And for the duration of this talk, I'm just going to say Gemini south node, and what I really mean is Gemini south node and south node in the third house, and same for Sagittarius in the ninth house, but I'm just going to use a shortcut of a shorter way of putting it, but just so you know. So actually, before I get to that, the way that I'm going to get into these two different nodal realities, I'm going to start off in like a normal situation where it's basic south node, basic north node situation. And at the end of the talk, I'll get into what they look like when they're squared and what some of the gifts and challenges of that placement is. And one last thing. This book, Astrology for the Soul by Jen Spiller, has been deeply instrumental in my astrology practice for getting to know the nodal placements. So a lot of what I'm sharing about the nodes is based off of her book and her research and my observation with clients. And then when it comes to synthesizing the nodes, that's been more of my own thoughts and observations. So starting with South Node in Gemini and in the third house, these individuals come here with really like a lot of practice being fluent in the daily kind of bustle of the world. They are really up on current events or whatever data streams that they have decided to tune into. They're really aware of what people are thinking and talking about. What are the current conversations? They're very sociable, and they understand how to have dialogue and tune into other people's languages. So speaking with someone who's a great conversationalist, and it just really feels like you're on the same page and there's a rapport, that's a very Geminian kind of faculty or facility. And their basic patterns and security, which is what the South Node is. Pluto is like our deep soul level security, and the South Node is how we have achieved that in the past. So for Gemini South Node, the security has revolved around just being on the same page as the people around them. And that can be about superficial details like plans and logistics. And it can also be not superficial. It can be how people feel, what's going on in their deep psyche. They could be really, really tuned in with the people around them. All the air signs are pretty social. And I included, I think that this is from, like, Juno is the name of the film. But I just thought the telephone would be a good image for it, and the little like absurdity of the hamburger phone. In this lifetime, these individuals can be insecure about their own truth. So if you think about them moving towards Sagittarius or the 9th house, that's where we have this vision of our own personal truth. And so these individuals can have a tendency to want to get a lot of feedback from others, like, what do you think about this? Or do more and more research. And this can diffuse their centeredness with their own truth. And to empathize with this, you know, you can just think of a time that you had like a really inspired idea. And instead of just acting on it and deciding that it was a yes, when you felt that full body yes and so much excitement about it, you were like asking other people what they thought. Maybe it wasn't that, you know, full bodied or that certain. I think that that's a little bit more of Sagittarius energy, but even just an inkling of an idea. And instead of developing it on your own, asking people and then kind of feeling your fire dampened when you get feedback that isn't totally like what your own intuition was telling you in the first place. And Gemini South Node people have developed this skill in prior lives of being really open to information. And that is a skill. It takes receptivity to be able to assimilate new information. They're also really receptive for feedback. And this can be at an excess for them at this point when they're moving into their North Node in Sagittarius of basically, if they keep pursuing more research and more data and more opinions, then they can kind of spin in place and end up talking themselves out of things that they were going to do. They're somewhat newer to using intuition as a way to make decisions because they've been very logical in prior lives. And so they can have these intuitive hunches that they explain away or talk themselves out of, only to realize that their original hunch was right. And so they're learning to orient more towards their intuition in this life. One thing that is happening with them is that if you come into this life and you're really good at tuning in with other people and being on the same page with other people, at some point, like part of paradigm shift even is like you're in a certain world and you understand that world and you're part of it. And then you start to grow or expand in a way that you can't fit in that world anymore. So there's a breakthrough. And Sagittarius loves that expansion and traveling and learning new things and aligning with one's personal truth. So if you're in this bubble where you're really aware of what people think and how people feel, and you're starting to grow or expand in a way that doesn't really fit with that circle anymore, then that's going to be kind of moving more into a Sagittarian experience. And this can be, in a sense, like leveling up. If, for example, like they have this kind of destiny or this trajectory carrying them forward, and if they just kind of stay where it's comfortable and where they know all the information and all the data already, that they can just kind of get stuck there. And so when we move into Sagittarian experience, it's kind of like the traveler who leaves home. There's a loss involved, and there's like a trade-off for a more expanded reality. So this can have to do as well with speaking out with more truth and seeing how different people like leave their lives and how other people will appear. And because they have this sense of their security being located on being on the same page as others, they can, where we have security needs is where we have manipulation tendencies. So if the way that we're orienting our security is that everyone's on the same page, then a way that one could be manipulative from that framework is trying to persuade or convince others of their perspective. These individuals might be super aware of how their words land, and And it's even kind of like thinking about Gemini as like the writer or the marketer, the salesperson, like knowing how to use language to be persuasive. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that if the motive is self-interested, then it probably doesn't have the best results. And self-interested in like a at the expense of others kind of self-interest. And what they're really needing to kind of lean into at that point is being able to put things out there and be more frank and direct. So one way to look at that is just like flat out naming something and saying what their desires are instead of trying to kind of like manipulate or trick people into doing something or thinking something, which is a more kind of like unconscious behavior. So I'm going to be talking about this throughout, but lies are a really big theme with Gemini and Sagittarius, and in different ways. So this whole axis is really about honesty in a lot of ways and dishonesty and aligning with honesty. So it can be really draining for these individuals when they lie. And if they're, moving into their Sagittarius North Node, that's all about authenticity and speaking their truth. And if they lie or are like a little bit tricky or a little bit deceitful, then they get into a pattern in their life where they have to keep validating that lie with other lies and basically building a web of non-truths. And it's not the best strategy for them. And if they're more honest, they actually do have a certain base level of tact as a nodal group, the South Node and Gemini people. So they can lean on that a little bit when they want to say things that are harder to say. It's also important for them to name their desires and just be forthright with them. And it tends to be good for the other people involved too. I have a lot, so I'm going to go a little bit quick. But these natives tend to have good manners. They're just like aware of what's on people's minds, and it's a social kind of air sign. So they can lean into a little bit more of that brash, like Sagittarian energy and still have a basic reserve of tact to fall back on. And so these individuals are also very open to experience, like random fun things here and there. They're not as familiar as having a mission and devotedly setting their sights on it, which is much more of a Sagittarian behavior. They can kind of anticipate that things will just happen for them randomly, like they'll just follow their curiosity and a random string of events will lead them to a cool destination because that's always happened for them in the past. And at an unconscious level, people with Gemini South Node can just kind of keep relying on that when they may kind of get to places, I don't know if faster is the right word, but just maybe, or like even efficiently. I don't think of the Gemini Sagittarius axis as the most like efficient oriented axis. I think it's a lot more about adventure and novelty. But if this individual is really struggling because they feel like directionless and they're just trying a bunch of different things and they're just hoping it works out magically, if they learn more about how to focus towards a particular goal and really lean into what excites them and what brings them alive as a way to trust that direction, then a lot of positive developments can happen for them. Okay, so this is the other node, and I just want to pause and see if anyone had any questions so far. Okay, so on the other direction, with South Node in Sagittarius or the 9th house and North Node in Gemini are the 3rd house. Rather than their counterpart, the Gemini South Node people Sagittarius South Node individuals have often chosen to leave the busyness of everyday life and go off on adventures, pursuing eternal truths and their own hero's journey. And so the Gemini South Node counterpart has been more likely current with social media or past equivalents of social media, the sense of like being just on the pulse of what's happening in society, current events, gossip, any of that kind of thing. And these are kind of like all elements that are like noise that the Sagittarius South Node person has potentially tuned out. And this can be really magical. Like if you have had a hermit experience in your life, or like you've gone to some kind of isolated place, or had positive experiences in isolation, getting in touch with your truth, there is like a very deep kind of brilliance of self that can come out in these experiences, and even like, you know, mystical experiences. And this person with this nodal signature has likely developed this capacity to do one singular thing with devotion, like being a priest, or even if it's not religious, though it often has something to do with a belief system with this nodal signature, there's a sense of kind of like doing a path and committing to it 100%. It's interesting though, because Sagittarius is mutable fire, and but it still has that, you know, potential for dogma or that kind of loyalty to a belief system. As a result of this going within and isolating themselves or following a path, they've come into this life with a really distinct point of view. So this person's familiar with isolation, and even when they were in society, whether in this life or in prior lives, they may have always felt different and more called to knowledge or philosophy than the people around them. And then once they left and gathered knowledge, they maybe felt separate by being more knowledgeable than their peers. This individual can have experience with having gathered very particularized forms of knowledge, like a belief system, and like not very much curiosity sometimes about other people, rather assuming things about them from that specific lens that they've come here with. So this can relate to feeling better than them or arrogant, and then this creates even further isolation and alienation for this individual because they are attached to their own truth. However, consciously or unconsciously, they can view other people through that filter and just see other people as not as aware and not as awake. And that kind of energy, other people pick up on and they don't like it. So there's a kind of separation that occurs. And on the other hand, if they are really kind of in their truth and they have this wisdom or this information that they've gathered, they also can be attractive to people for that very reason, and often in the role of like teachers, or I put like minister-esque roles here because it's not necessarily someone who is literally a minister, but someone who is just like the advice giver or the wise person in a group. And this individual has likely had miraculous or religious experiences and has a lot of knowledge to share. But in this life, leaning into Gemini and third house qualities will empower them in their life path. And the reason for this is because these individuals can, before developing the Gemini qualities, be kind of clumsy in conversation. They can be aggressive about their point of view, super fiery, and they can have this way of signaling in conversations and even in relationships that they're really not open to other people's perspectives because they themselves know and they are right. And this continues the patterns of alienation that this person has already felt because people may not want to be around that. And these individuals can also dominate conversation. So Gemini is kind of more that like banter and back and forth, and Sagittarius will preach or lecture or storytell for long periods of time without checking in with anyone and how they're doing, which can also be cumbersome or exhausting for other people, at least at some point. And the Sagittarius South Node person can actually be somewhat like clueless as to what effect they're having on others when they do this. They can think that the other person is, not relating to the ideas that they're sharing. When it's actually more the attitude or the arrogance or the domineering fieriness that is bothersome to people. And this Sagittarius South Node person really wants to be the holder of knowledge, or to be a teacher, or to be seen in their wisdom. And they can achieve that so much easier if they develop a faculty for pleasant and light conversation. If they get on other people's wavelength, so same page, which is a Gemini thing, they can offer wisdom easily through simple encounters. And they actually, because they are such deeply wise individuals oftentimes, then when they have basic conversation that feels like small talk, it's almost kind of like metaphorical, or something deep can emerge from it, and they can have an impact on other people in a way that they don't even realize. So they will probably feel a lot of healing and a lightening of pressure if they start to become more genuinely curious about other people, and to see other people as excellent or as knowledgeable in their own right, and specifically not judging people according to their highly particularized, specialized point of view. This curiosity can even be performative at first, but when it becomes genuine, and it will, like if that's the phase, part of what Sagittarius can do is think that it already knows everything. So there's nothing to be curious about. And once that filter is dropped and the Sagittarian or Sagittarian South Node person is genuinely curious, they will receive new information, and they could even experience more awe from it. Or they can have their belief systems challenged, and that might threaten their security. So I feel like Gemini isn't locating its security in the truth, but more in this like capacity to always see through different lenses. And so when South Node in Sagittarius, or the ninth house, learns how to enter other people's realities, they can become more effective at communicating. I felt like I was roasting this placement a little bit when I was writing this. But when they kind of figure out the Gemini stuff, they have a way of just kind of creating mystical portals in everyday conversation. They're really learning how to check in with others and ask questions, how to be curious, and how to become genuinely more available for feedback. They don't feel secure not knowing based on their South Node, and have potentially had prior life situations where they were in these clearly defined roles as knowers. It's interesting, this even reminded me of Mark Jones's work for the astrology community in Healing the Soul. He talks about the astrologer in client work, needs to really let go of their ego attachment to being a knower, and that when you stop having insightful things to say, you can just ask the person who's right in front of you a question, because they are themselves like the authority or the expert on their own life, and you're the astrologer, and so you can collaborate. So this sense of like not being in that unconscious place of being like, I know, and I'm going to teach everyone around me, even though they probably do have things to teach. So what else here? These are some of the things I've already been saying, so I'll move on. So now to break it down to when the nodes are squared. So we've explored two different realities, and I hope that they appear distinctly opposite. You have Gemini South Node, who's like curious, flexible, agile, aware of what other people are thinking, not as secure in their own truth, likes to get a lot of feedback, learning how to like follow their excitement and pick a path. Sagittarius South Node, really distinct point of view that they come into this life with, some challenges with arrogance and the need to become more curious. So when the nodes are squared, this has really been interesting to reflect on this, because with every other nodal group, I feel a lot more obvious of a storyline around how do they vacillate. And with Gemini Sagittarius, I've often seen them more likely synthesized somehow, and not super extreme Gemini and then super extreme Sagittarius. If you've been watching the rest of these series and continue to watch them, you might pick up on that. So if anyone has this signature and has any insight on how it shows up for you, I would love to hear that in the comments and at the end of this if there's time. But what I notice about these individuals that have these nodes squared is that they're really open to experience. And instead of just like a little experience here and a little experience there, and this kind of like jumping from stone to stone in a really lighthearted hummingbird Gemini fashion, it's like big experience to another big experience. And so they have these kind of like winding epics in their lives, and that potentially might be an issue, but also might just be an adventurous life led. Another thing that I notice that's really beautiful about this position when these nodes are squared is that they have the skill sets of both nodes developed. So it's someone who is a pretty good conversationalist oftentimes, who also has like a lot of wisdom. And I find when I speak to people with this signature that we'll be having casual conversation and they just kind of very fluidly offer advice in a way that feels really harmonic. It doesn't feel unsolicited or out of touch. Like it just feels like an enlightening conversation. So they can be really like delightful in this way. And I think that maybe some more of the conflict for them is just the kind of like mental games of going from place to place, and this thing seems true and this thing seems true, so what's true? And like this kind of like frenetic like mental activity. One thing I've also noticed is that this nodal group has an especially notable concern about semantics and etymology and the meanings of words. More so than other nodal groups, even if they're not squared, but I think even more so when they are. And I think of this kind of like a spell or a prayer that has results that shift based on the wording. So the kind of be careful what you wish for, or like the stories of genies where if you word something in a certain way, you get the wish, but in a really trickstery way. So I think with that in mind, they're even really careful about the meanings of what they say. Also, they have such big, vast awarenesses that it's like, how do they even communicate these big ideas? And it's always going to be an act of translation. There's never like a perfect translation. So they can get a little bit hung up on the words sometimes. And sometimes so much so that it keeps them from acting quickly because they're like thinking about it so much beforehand. And it's possible that they can also learn along the way or just define their terms as they're using it. I also see this kind of quality here of being able to invent their own languages or catchphrases. And I don't actually have Mystic Medusa's chart or Caroline Casey's chart, but they're two astrologers that came to mind who have their own language. If you've ever seen Caroline Casey talk, like it's a peak experience. She's such a like enlivening storyteller, and her ideas and her speaking is just like world opening and portal opening. And she has like an audiobook, Making the Gods Work for You, which I'd recommend. It's like a really like lovely book. But she has phrases, if you listen to her talk, that are very distinct to her. And you'll hear her use them over and over again, and you get to go into another world because there's a different language. And same with Mystic Medusa. She has an astrology blog, and she's made up phrases like for the Uranus-Pluto square of 2012 to 2015, she called it the Zap Zone. And she had like she has catchphrases about a lot of things, and it builds a deeper understanding of things through the playfulness and cleverness of language. Some more challenges for the when this nodal axis is squared. They can get stuck if they're trying to discover or fulfill their destiny alone. In general, these folks tend to need a lot of feedback, and this combines some of the Gemini and Sagittarius stuff where they need to really open up to feedback from the universe and their guides and their deep intuition, but also feedback from friends and guides and people they meet along the path. Or even just like learning how to have a relationship with source or with different deities or with angels or with their dream realm, like having philosophical conversation, not just with people, but with the divine it tends to be good for them. And life can get really slow and stagnant for them when they aren't in conversation about the questions and the quandaries and desires that they have, and when they just try to manage it by themselves. Jason Hawley says that Mercury, its one agenda as a planet is to keep the story going. And so when we disseminate information or we receive information, we're taking part of this like fluidity in life. And so not having dialogues, not being open to information can stall the story, basically. And I put here, they probably should just accept that they are dynamic, fluid philosophers and that needing help is not a sign of failure or like not knowing, but it's actually just a sign that they are on the quest. The hero has many guides and helpers, and they themselves can be helpers wherever they go because they are so naturally attuned to the contemplation and dissemination of wisdom. To be fair, they may also need time alone and to just like tune in with themselves. But even as they tune in with themselves, they're still accessing this inner channel of knowledge and their connection to source, whether that is explicitly felt to them or if they just feel like they're grounding into themselves. But it feels like wisdom and information is a constant through line. Also, a challenge for them is rationalization. As I was saying before, a major issue with this axis of Gemini and Sagittarius is lying, and each sign does so in different ways. Gemini can twist the facts and the details, or even just generate false information, trickery and manipulation, and also misrepresentation. And then Sagittarius will exaggerate and overcompensate. So we lie to ourselves when we're like, yeah, this is fine, this is great. And it's funny too, because that act of pretending that things are better than they are is a form of magic as well. A lot of spiritual teachings talk about how the word is magic. And so we can basically cast spells with our thoughts and what we say. So it's a fine line of when is it deceitful and when is it creative. Sagittarius can lie to themselves, tell tall tales, and also there's kind of like a selective memory or selective storytelling quality. And I've noticed that people with Gemini and Sagittarius emphasized in their chart, or third house, ninth house, can often just self-correct their behavior naturally. Like they will spontaneously say a thing and then immediately after say, wait, that's not true, and correct it. And there's so many different ways of looking at situations and so many different corners of memory that it just kind of happens sometimes that we think or say something and we're like, wait a minute, that isn't true. What about when we don't examine those things though, and we just build and build and build on top of those things? That's where this becomes a lot more of an issue. So if this is a person's habitual patterns or major life decisions that are based off of overriding their intuition, not trusting themselves, thinking that they're fine with something and like rationalizing why something is beautiful even when they don't feel good about it, and just kind of accruing and accruing and accruing, or going down these different turns of paths that have nothing to do with where they want to be. And if we think about Virgo and Pisces being likely the planets or the signs that the planets that are squaring them are in, it can be an out of sign square. But we have like alignment, which is Virgo, and delusion and confusion, which is Pisces, as, you know, just a very narrow exploration of those two archetypes. So thinking about like, what if you don't say what you mean over and over and over again in your life, and you have a lot of things built up in your life over it? So getting to that place of telling the truth and even knowing the truth inside of oneself is maybe like what's really up with a nodal square here. And That was my last slide. So does anyone have any questions?
I'll just check for you in Facebook.
I don't have a question, but oh my God, you just described me. Plus my third house south node is Virgo. So, on top of that, it's extra Mercury, and it's squared by Uranus, which has been disseminate or passing, but it's been brought into focus with the eclipses over the last few years. And so the bit about trusting your intuition, trusting my intuition has become very important in recently. Thank you. This is awesome.
Thanks, Sue.
Yes, Sabrina, I was going to say the same thing. I have the Gemini South Node, and it's squared by my Sun and Jupiter and Pluto. It's like really spot on. I relate to most of it, and the things that I feel like might not be within me, I see so clearly outside of myself in other people. Just really aware of all of those things.
Totally.
Sabrina, there's a question in the chat from Nicole. Can you see it?
Yeah. For the suggested affect observations, does it matter what planet is forming the square? It totally does. The planet forming the square is the issue. That's the impasse. The nodal axis is the personality structure that holds it. So as an example, like I can speak from my own experience with having like Mercury, Venus square my nodes in Cancer, Capricorn, and Mercury, Venus is at late Pisces. And for me, I'm constantly have all these like upwelling things to say and, Mercury, Venus experience, but my nodal axis is more about the Capricorn side's a little bit rigid and like wants to do everything right and not get in trouble. And the Cancer is like a little bit more like potentially leaky. And so throughout my life, I have had the struggle of saying too much, like just like putting a lot out there or something, and then feeling bad about it or feeling shame, which is more of the Capricorn part, and then like tightening it up and like getting rigid again. And then from that Capricorn rigidity, like the Cancerian explosion, and then the explosion is like, ew, I did that, so let me put it back. And just noticing that I do that Cancer Capricorn dance, just like learning how to synthesize that more has been an ongoing like discovery ever since I found evolutionary astrology. So the impasse is, the Mercury Venus part. The personality pattern and the net that holds it is the Cancer Capricorn. So one thing I would suggest too is that if you're interested in like planets that are square the nodal axis, Mark Jones has a series on Astrology University about all these different, all the planets squaring the nodes. So it's almost like it's a different lens to look at this through, but the concept of vacillating between different experiences has really fascinated me. So yeah, it does matter what planets are forming the square, but it's like a whole other story.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, any final questions? Okay, looks like that's it. Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
Looking forward to the next one, which will be Cancer Capricorn in a couple of weeks.
I've already revealed myself.
Okay, would you all please unmute and thank Sabrina Monarch.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, ma'am. It was wonderful.